webinar. Going to transition over to talking about quantum and the effects that it's having, both what is kind of the state of the art and how is that affecting the U.S. and particularly its allies, right, and partners around the world, and what are we going to be facing in the future. So with that, Michael, I will turn it over to you, and thank you again for getting up at quite literally in the middle of the night for you. So over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's good to get to speak to all of you. It's good to see some friends and colleagues, and I'm always happy to share the stage with Elsa. I wanted to keep my remarks reasonably short and leave the dominant amount of time for Q&A afterwards, because I know that this is a topic that engenders quite a lot of curiosity, incredulity, and even confusion. And I thought I would start by giving just a bit of background about what this field is. What is quantum technology? One way to phrase it in the way that I like is that quantum technology harnesses quantum physics as a resource. And in so doing, it is likely to prove as transformational in the 21st century as harnessing electricity was in the 19th. Now, I know that sounds, a bit grandiose, but the reality is there are deep parallels in the way we learned to access a physical resource, the flow of electricity, and then put it to work. And we're doing exactly the same thing in quantum technology. Now, again, understanding that we all sell our own book, and this is a field in which I've worked for the last 20 years, it is useful to have some milestones in the field to demonstrate just how impactful this really is. And the best one is the realization that the first true quantum technology, the first quantum technology that uses the full range of quantum physical phenomena that we find on very small size scales, is atomic timekeeping. And atomic timekeeping is what has given us GPS. So the amount of impact we've already had or already seen from quantum technology is really quite profound. Now, the key areas of activity in this field are broadly classed as quantum computing, quantum communications, and quantum sensing. Now, I think those are self-explanatory topics, but in many respects, the one that has the dominant cultural zeitgeist right now is quantum computing. This is a field in which we think about encoding information using the rules of quantum physics that we find on very small size scales, and then attacking problems that are otherwise often intractable for either practical or fundamental reasons on conventional machines. The real motivator for the development of this field was the discovery in the 1990s by Peter Shor, then at ATT Labs, now at MIT, that if one built a machine that worked in this way, one could solve a very specific problem that was of tremendous relevance, and that is factoring prime numbers, decomposing a large number into the two prime factors, numbers divisible by only one in themselves. And while it sounds a bit of an esoteric mathematical problem, many people in the audience will recognize that that problem mathematically is the basis for developing security in all public key crypto systems. So anytime you use a web browser and it says HTTPS, the security is coming from the complexity of that math problem. Now, after Peter Shor developed this algorithm in the mid-1990s and published it, there was an immediate growth in interest from US public sector agencies. And a fact that is, I would say, often overlooked is that the entire field owes its existence to the National Security Agency in the US. The National Security Agency, in response to the publication of this algorithm, started its first ever, to the best of my understanding, public university research program, aiming to ask the question of whether such machines could be built and whether this new capability could be realized. Now, that was a program that really started within a couple of years of the publication of this algorithm and has been running continuously since then. Now, for full disclosure, I was funded by this program as a PhD student at Harvard. I'm funded by it still today in my academic research and in the company I run, Q-Control. But this idea that it has been the military complex in the US, the DoD and the NSA that have driven this is, again, a topic that I think is not well understood. Commensurate with that is the idea that the field was completely dominated by academia until approximately 2013, 2014. At that time, there was absolutely no non-academic, that is industrial research at substantial scale. And we saw that at that time, very big bets were made, bets by IBM and Google and Microsoft, doubling down on smaller internal R&D efforts. Those grew very rapidly in the middle of the 2010s. And since that time, we've seen actually a tremendous shift from academia to industrially driven programs that are run by large-scale industry like those I've indicated already, but also startups like Q-Control, the company that I run, and others in the community, our friends at Rigetti and the like. Now, this field has really focused, as I mentioned, on quantum computing, but at the same time, quantum sensing is another area of application that is quite substantial, and I'll come to that in a minute. But it's important to understand that the quantum technology space and the quantum technology application space in particular is extremely diverse. In quantum computing, of course, it starts with this problem of breaking crypto systems, but it turns out that that is a much longer play than many people had hoped. And we still are talking about decades until machines of that scale are available. But in the interim, we've discovered that we can attack problems in optimization, for logistics, in chemistry and material science, potentially finance, on timescales that are much shorter than what we think about for cryptography. And in a similar spirit, we see that quantum sensing is also a nearer term application of quantum technology. There are many ways that people are thinking about making quantum sensors, but the dominant idea is that quantum technologies are very fragile. In fact, their fragility is their Achilles heel. But in quantum sensing, we turn that into an asset, and we use it to detect extremely small signals that are often derived from magnetic targets or gravitational signatures or accelerations. And this is allowing us to build a variety of technologies like highly stable quantum clocks, new generations of atomic clocks, navigation systems that leverage quantum accelerometry to give very low, what's called baseline drift devices. That in turn allows GPS-denied navigation in contested battlefields, which of course is a key strategic priority area for the defense sector. Now, the question that I think is on everyone's mind is about the state of the art in China. The reality is that China is in fact rising very rapidly. As I mentioned, the field got its start with public sector investment from US intelligence and defense agencies. Those agencies funded researchers all around the world, including in Australia. I find myself in Australia because of the research connections between the US and Australia in this field going back to the late 1990s. But China has built its own research prioritization in this field. It started with quantum communications and has now extended more recently into quantum computing. There is an extremely strong scientific research base in China, and now we see that this is being driven in a bit of a top-down approach through the Academy of Sciences and a program run by Zhang Weipan to realize national or sovereign capability within China in quantum computing. Now, we've seen just recently that a Chinese team was able to demonstrate what's called quantum supremacy, that is attacking a problem that is effectively impossible for even a conventional supercomputer. The caveat, of course, is that the problem is not useful. It is a toy test problem designed for this purpose alone. They did that in a device built from photons. And then more recently, I believe it was just a couple of days ago, there was a demonstration of a 62 qubit, that is a quantum bit, or the fundamental information carrier in a quantum computer, 62 qubit machine that is approximately the same scale and capability as what we've seen coming out of Google and IBM and others, and using a similar technology as well. Now, understanding the strategic competition aspect is an understandably challenging topic. And this is challenging because of the role of hype and self-promotion in the media. And the media is in fact being used as a bit of a weapon in generating the narrative around this field. Now, the way that manifests is reflected in the shape of the economy. In the US, this is a challenge with large-scale technology companies and some very early startups that embraced quantum and put out media releases that are marketing, but are in many cases extremely misleading in terms of the state of the art of the technology. And this goes way back to our early pronouncements in 2007 that have, of course, not panned out. It remains a problem today. It is very difficult for analysts in national security to parse what is happening in the technical field because many of the media pronouncements are simply misleading, right? Or at very least, they overly promote the contributions of the releaser of the media release. Now, the reality is that things are no different in China, except the economy's shape is different, and so there is dominance by the state. And this invites the introduction of substantial nationalist sentiments. And so we see that there are many pronouncements about Chinese sovereign capability, which are similarly not borne out by the facts of technological advancement, either in the open or from what we know of industrial effort in China. Now, my favorite example of this is quantum radar. Quantum radar was an idea that if you use quantum physics in a standoff detection or radar type setting, you could render stealth vulnerable and detect otherwise undetectable aircraft. And there were some very big state media pronouncements about quantum radar that left the national security analysts in the US reporting in a breathless fashion. The reality, of course, was that none of it was true. There is laboratory effort in this field, but even in the last couple of years, the original pioneer of this field named Jeff Shapiro came out and wrote technical manuscripts with all the counterpoints about how it could never work in the way that was originally envisioned. And so it's important to take with a grain of salt the pronouncements that come in this field because there is now this blending of nationalist sentiment with just a desire to be seen as a leader that is reflective of all the media narrative we see today. Now, the final point that I'll make here is about the importance and I would say essential nature of multilateral cooperation. I mentioned before that the National Security Agency and the DoD in the US have been funders of global research, incorporating a wide variety of non-traditional players like Australia, players like Austria and Germany that have for a long time made contributions in this field. What we see right now is a rise of nationalism or at least regionalism in the development of this technology as it pertains to sovereign capability. And we see that even the EU is running programs that reasonably transparently look to be about strategic competition with the US in this space. And I would say that the history of successes in the field suggests that this is not a viable pathway forward, that aligned nations that believe in liberal democracy, the EU, the US, Japan, obviously the rest of the Five Eyes, should be aligned on the technology development, which includes, of course, sharing across borders, which is a critical aspect of this field because it is so early. Now, at that point, I wanted to conclude my remarks and invite everybody to ask questions. I understand that this is a very challenging topic, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to speak a bit more about the development of this field and how it actually pertains to work in AI as well. So thanks very much.
Perfect. That was super helpful. Elsa, do you have any thoughts on that as kind of at least Cassie's resident expert on all things? You're the one I turn to, so I'll turn first to you for comments and thoughts.
Absolutely. Well, first, I'm honored to be continuing the conversation with Mike, from whom I've learned so much on how to make sense of the hype and reality of quantum science and technology, as I've tried to make sense of what is happening within China's innovation ecosystem on this front. There's no one better to hear from, so I'm so glad you had a chance to hear from him in setting the stage first, and I will try to add a couple of further points as to what I think is unique about China's quantum information science as this ecosystem has taken shape in recent history. And I think, as I'd say, first of all, to anyone who still believes today that China can't innovate, this is a powerful counterexample, because certainly the progress that has been achieved is undeniable and significant. And certainly there have been elements of hype and in state media with the appearance of techno propaganda, and the prestige of this as a hallmark of China's rise as an innovation powerhouse has been a common theme and often invoked, and certainly there is a lot of national pride behind moments like China's launch of the world's first quantum satellite in 2016, which appeared to anyone looking at the headlines to be a dramatic advance, but in actuality, some of the significance there was not that no one else could have launched a quantum satellite, but rather that the Chinese government was willing to dedicate the investment to doing so, and to create a capability that could allow for experimental advancements as well. And I think that is a unique combination of factors when it comes to China's plans, policies, and programs in quantum science and technology, a combination of strength in academic research enabled by exchange with this international community of scientists in this space, including, of course, that Pan Jianwei himself, who's often described as the father of quantum science in China, had started off much of his academic research working with Anton Zeilinger in Vienna, and had returned to China around 2000 or 2001, when the University of Science and Technology of China stood up the first major quantum laboratory in China, intending to build a national program in its own right. And I think this is how the capacity to cultivate and leverage talent and experience in leading laboratories around the world has been a strength of China's programming on that front, including through talent plans. But again, I think that ultimately the best course for the US and for other countries going forward continues to be that of scientific openness, given the structure of this field, and given that so much of this has still been in the realm of basic research. So I think the capacity of the Chinese government to direct funding to basic research, to place big bets, even when the future potential of these disciplines seemed less certain, was a major enabler here. And initiatives like quantum experiments at space scale, once a proof of concept, is now becoming a new type of infrastructure. And again, although China's strength as a leading implementer of quantum communications does not mean we should believe that China's systems are going to be truly unhackable or uncrackable. There are potential improvements in cybersecurity that come with leveraging techniques like quantum key distribution. And certainly the intention behind these programs and investments is to develop a more secure infrastructure that can be secure against and defend against incursions by foreign adversaries. And often I think it's notable and ironic that the leaks by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden are invoked as a justification and rationale for the development of quantum communications as an approach to enhance cybersecurity. And again, we should be skeptical of whether this will provide the perfect shield that Chinese scientists have sometimes appeared to promise that quantum cryptography would provide. But we have seen this communications infrastructure taking shape with ground stations, with fiber optic networks, with this initial satellite and a future constellation of satellites, and the world's first quantum secured video call between Beijing and Vienna. So I think certainly we're seeing capacity for implementation and drive for new type infrastructure. I think is likely being used in military communications as well as a means of enhancing C4ISR, and I think will definitely be worth watching going forward. As you heard from Mike, in quantum computing, China has started to really contest leadership with the United States in some fronts, and I think it's interesting here that it's not only some of the academic research and advancements we've seen, but also Chinese companies joining the fray as well, whether that is Baidu or Alibaba. And Alibaba was among the first to launch a cloud-enabled quantum computing device available for use. Baidu has launched Paddle Quantum, a quantum machine learning framework that is also available. And there even have been a couple of Chinese startups in the space that claim to have achieved major progress. So I think this ecosystem is continuing to evolve and expand, and not beyond the national planning and programming, including the construction of a national laboratory in quantum information science, the increased partnerships between academia and industry, the drive to really commercialize these technologies and build up a new market here. think is significant. And going forward, if quantum computing is not so much a race as perhaps a marathon, and a marathon run along several courses in tandem with the different types of qubits being used and the different approaches in working towards general purpose quantum computing, I think what we're seeing happen within China today is significant and will merit continued attention going forward. And I think we're already starting to see potential impactful applications, including emerging from partnerships involving the Chinese defense industry, looking to leverage quantum navigation on submarines, or means missile guidance, quantum communications underwater, or for maritime communications. And I think while quantum sensing and radar do merit a great deal of skepticism, I think there certainly is the drive and desire to have new techniques with greater sensitivity going forward as a range of the portfolio of options that are under development today. So I guess I'd say I think this is has been a really fascinating landscape to watch, and one in which beyond and despite the hype, there is really significant potential for transformation in the world as we know it. And yeah, we'll look forward to your questions and continuing the conversation as we try to make sense of these spooky possibilities.
That's great. And I think one of the things that kind of tied both of your presentations together, especially the fact that, Michael's actually in Australia doing joint partnership work, if you think about it from there, is just, and also mentioned the satellite, right? Because we all attribute it to China, but it was also done in partnership with the Austrians. So I wondered if you both want to care to comment just on kind of the state of, I guess, internationalization of these drives. Are they mostly nationalistic, or do we see, for whatever reason, kind of more academic work across borders on some of the quantum, just the fundamental quantum issues? And we'll talk about the applications here in a minute.
Yeah, I would say, the dominant funder of quantum physics and quantum information research remains the United States Department of Defense and intelligence community. The biggest programs are run by the NSA, the LPS, funded by the Army Research Office, and IARPA, the intelligence version of DARPA. Both fund international participants. I mean, my lab is a participant in programs run by both organizations. But more importantly, my academic team with IARPA is part of a European consortium that involves participants from Austria, Switzerland, and the UK. So this is the tenor of the international collaboration that has been, the true characteristic of the field going all the way back to the late 1990s. The really amazing thing about this early NSA program was that it did bring the best researchers from around the world at a time when quantum information or quantum computing was not a field. We came to this activity from fields like condensed matter physics and atomic physics, and in some cases information theory and the like, or computer science. But it was this international program run by the US DoD and IC that built the field, built the international field. What we've seen much more recently, that is the last, let me say 5 years or so, has been a drive for sovereign capability. And one can understand this, of course, but sovereign capability is often maybe misinterpreted or misapplied as building walls. So commensurate with the drive for sovereign capability has been a drive for dramatically strengthened export controls, even within Five Eyes intelligence sharing nations. And because this is a field where even the United States government classifies most work in quantum information as basic science, it is an extraordinarily early stage at which to be attempting to apply strong export controls. The reality is that our colleagues and peers in China are able to read, and they can read technical manuscripts, and they are very smart and have been educated in many of the best institutions around the world. Jean Weipan's personal story is indicative of this. The whole shape and trajectory of Chinese efforts overall in a strategic fashion in quantum information come from his personal experience working in quantum communications in Austria. Those links, those personal links remain with Europe, although obviously it's getting harder to maintain them with our colleagues in China, which in many respects is a great shame considering the state of the field.
I'll just add that I concur, and I think I worry sometimes that we believe that security means closing off our innovation ecosystem and defending against foreign threats. And I think the reality is that we can be stronger and more competitive when we have the confidence to sustain openness in research collaborations, and also to recognize that we are not going to succeed by attempting the impossible, by attempting to reverse globalization, to prevent the diffusion of ideas or knowledge or talent. And I think there are kind of questions around talent programs and recruiting, research integrity and disclosures. There are legitimate conversations to be had on that front, including the cases of Chinese scientists, sometimes with military affiliations, not being wholly transparent about their activities or intentions. I think it is reasonable to have a conversation about how do we evaluate those risks, and how do we have better screening in place, or better, clearer policies for those who do receive US funding as to whom they can collaborate with beyond that, and whether there are any restrictions in place. But I think certainly, so again, we're seeing that the interesting juxtaposition here of focus on competition with the drive for sovereign capabilities, with the inquiry in the field being very much at awesome time. And I think to the extent that this contradiction, it also exists in the Chinese government is approaching these capabilities. I think this is a possible tension or liability in China's approach as well. That again, we've seen Xi Jinping call for and highlight the importance of international scientific cooperation, and Chinese S&T leaders talk about open science as a trend of the times, and yet we have seen potential restrictions or curtailment or greater parameters on Chinese engagement in international scientific inquiry in some cases. Some cases of more oversight or approval over publication or sharing of results in some contexts, as there is seen to be greater sensitivity around this technology. And I think if China does take more of a closed and sovereign approach to quantum technology through this flagship program, and if the US continues to remain more open and collaborative in its orientation, I think the US model is likely to be more successful through leveraging those partnerships to the fullest and sustaining that openness, so long as we also continue to provide the resources to sustain the basic research and competitiveness and experiment with applications going forward, which I think is starting to happen. Some of the efforts of the National Quantum Initiative, and some of which arguably were developed and provoked by concern about what China was doing with its plans and policies. And I think sometimes that reactivity or concern with competition can be productive if it drives us to increase investments that can be worthwhile. But I worry that the focus on competition can be counterproductive and looking at China as a impetus for our own efforts can be counterproductive when it results in measures that may backfire or may place us at a disadvantage. So I think that the tricky balance, whether we're talking about AI or QIS, is that we have to compete without closing off, and we have to recognize that these are domains critical to security and our economy without treating them as if they can be readily bound by our borders. And that's a very new way of thinking about economic security and national security.
I want to keep pulling the thread on the money issue real quick. And I was just wondering if you could explain to some of those with the non-technical background, how difficult is this? I think the last panel touched on it a little bit about, our decision to essentially, export the fabrication market largely to Taiwan, right? And we're trying to get back, but we hear how it's, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to rebuild. How expensive is it to build these quantum, I guess it's really probably all the stuff that goes around actually then building the quantum computers. But just, can you give us a sense of a scope and a scale of how difficult this is, how much money we're talking, and then maybe just compare it to the current chips?
Yeah, I mean, so the first answer is very hard. The question is, what is the objective? Is the objective to duplicate today's toy research systems. I mean, remember, quantum computers don't do anything useful right now, right? They're getting close. And we think that in the next, let's say, 5 or so years, we may cross this threshold when it's actually either economically or in some other measure advantageous to employ a quantum computer for some very niche applications. But quantum computers today do not do anything useful. So when we're talking about building machines, broadly, you know, to build your own version of today's toy machines, it's, you know, a $5 to $10 million minimum investment that an academic team would undertake. Now, if you want to not just duplicate that, but you want to now move towards leapfrogging over the existing industry to develop new technologies that are in fact cutting edge or even providing quantum advantage, this is now, you know, a multi-billion-dollar initiative that will span many years. And what we've seen, again, coming back to the arc of Jean Weipan's career in China, is that for many years, China had no quantum computing at all. It had exclusively effort in quantum communications, right? And it was based on the successes that Jean Weipan had in quantum communications that he was able strategically to get the resourcing and the hiring and the, you know, the return of previously emigrated Chinese scientists to lead programs domestically. And it has been over the last 5 or 8 years that we've seen growth in the domestic capability of Chinese teams in quantum information. That said, the leaders of those teams all did their, you know, postdoctoral research fellowships at Google or IBM or other equivalent locations, pursuing open science. And then they took what they knew, they duplicated. And so where are they? They are at a stage where they're approximately equivalent to the state of the art today. It remains a very long-term and very expensive play to consider developing this kind of technology at a useful scale, which is in fact why it was so concerning to me and many others that the Chinese government made a national strategic priority of this, investing you know, $10 billion or something directly into quantum information at a time that predated the U.S. National Quantum Initiative, which in fact is much smaller and focused on more basic science activities. I still think there is a need for more strategic prioritization of funding of this across the Five Eyes nations.
And I'll just add that I'll admit I do not have a great estimate offhand of exactly how many billions China is dedicating to quantum science and technology, including because I've stopped counting in a sense, and because I'm skeptical of some of the numbers that get tossed around. So notionally, the national laboratory that has been under construction, sort of a hub, building off the foundation of the University of Science and Technology of China, as well as a network of laboratories, including in Beijing and Shanghai as well. I think received an initial pledge in the neighborhood of 1 billion. I've seen the number 10 billion tossed around in press and by some of the scientists involved. Unclear where exactly all of that funding is going, given that the laboratory over the past couple of years has been a concept and flagship program that is still taking shape in its totality. And I think, again, there's been robust support for basic research. There's been extensive investment in building up this nascent quantum infrastructure within cities and with the National Backbone Network and stations that link up to the quantum satellite and the like. So I think the resourcing is significant, but I don't get too caught up in trying to, at least I haven't so far, and trying to look at the numbers specifically, because I think what is more significant than the amount of funding, and of course, even if we knew exactly how much, we wouldn't know exactly the return on investment, whether it's being invested wisely, whether it's going to the right priorities or being it's politically determined. But I think what is more significant than the exact amount is the capacity to attract and nurture talent, and building up an ecosystem where there is that sizable funding and opportunity for scientists to go into the space, to pursue research and experiment and really carry the field forward, as well as beyond state support, the increased amounts of funding from Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, the major Chinese technology companies, and several startups like Origin Quantum coming into the space. So I think we can't quite do an apples to apples comparison between funding at the end of the day. We can try, that would be a much longer conversation, but I think the significant takeaway is that the funding and investment are important, but I think even more critical, as we had discussed in talking about rivalry in AI as well as talent as a foundation and really fundamental consideration. And I think in STEM education and opportunities in education within the United States, and encouraging scientists who are coming out of US academic programs to stay here and have opportunities to pursue research within the United States, or to remain connected to American colleagues in pursuing research worldwide. I think those are, I'm not gonna, certainly from a strategic perspective, as we think about S&T strategy and national priorities, we can toss numbers around, but I think ultimately it's about having a healthy and vibrant ecosystem that is attracting talent, bringing it in, enabling that sharing of knowledge, and really promoting opportunity for researchers going forward.
Well, because so much of that research is, as you both said, basic research, right? Because we're still at the kind of the forefront. How much, can you give us an idea of how much it crosses from computing to communication to sensing to any of those things? So how much is it transferable, or how much is it, hey, I'm doing quantum computing and the only thing I got in relation to quantum sensing is the word quantum in it, and there's kind of no overlap. So if you could give us an idea of what the Venn diagram looks like for those fields.
I mean, there certainly is overlap between them. Quantum sensing uses technology bases that are also used in quantum computing, whether they are cold trapped atoms, as are used by certain teams like atom computing, whether they are nitrogen vacancy centers in diamonds. So these is a special realization of a solid state approach to both quantum computing and potentially quantum magnetometry. There are overlaps there. There are overlaps in the fact that in many respects, a quantum sensor is a 1-qubit quantum computer. Now, that is not a one-to-one. It's not always exactly like that, but in many cases, you can think of it that way. So the system engineering that is required to build a 1,000,000-qubit machine or the like is not a driver in the development of a quantum sensing hardware platform. There are other technological drivers, but a lot of what we learned in building high-quality, high-performance quantum computing hardware translates over. In fact, this is part of what my company does. We do quantum control engineering that spans both spaces because all the lessons we learn in quantum computing translate over into quantum sensing. Now, quantum comms is maybe a little bit different. There is activity in quantum computing using photons, using light. There are companies that do this. PsiQuantum in the United States is one such company. Xanadu in Canada is another. There is some core shared technology that overlaps there. But in many respects, the similarities end pretty abruptly because the technological drivers, what must be accomplished in order to build a useful system, are quite divergent. Now, one thing I just wanted to say to sum up here is that when we think about quantum communications, it is useful to get third-party opinions on this. And one of my favorites that's come out recently is, in fact, from the NSA. The NSA published a document advisory about QKD systems because there is so much activity in the media in China in particular about this, where their summary conclusion is, in summary, the NSA views quantum resistant or post-quantum cryptography as a more cost-effective and easily maintained solution than quantum key distribution. For all these reasons, NSA does not support the usage of QKD or quantum communications to protect communications in national security systems. Right. So it's a rather strong statement, but it's useful to understand. Again, coming back to the question of how much we're talking about narrative crafting versus the actual state of technology.
And I just add on that front that I think there continues to be some debate on the utility of quantum cryptography, but China's position and prioritization of it does diverge from the norm and consensus that some of these investments in research and experimentation with applications will yield results or benefits that are unexpected. A lot of talk of working towards a future quantum internet and starting to have more of an integrated communications capability, building off of that. But another interpretation might be if we believe the NSA and take a very, very skeptical perspective on what China has been doing, is that perhaps this is an example of a bad bet or a relative failure, where there's been some amount of waste in having such extensive dedication of resources to quantum cryptography as a means of securing communications when that is not the best alternative available. So in that respect, we might also regard this as a weakness of China's S&T planning process, where anxieties about cyber insecurity provoked a less productive direction of development. I think still room for debate on that front, and I'll defer to the scientists on either side of that debate, but I think it is a really fascinating as a case study of how well do we think Chinese S&T planners and policymakers are doing in, of the mega projects they're pursuing on different fronts. Are the right bets being placed, and are the right investments being dedicated to high potential developments, or are there cases where there are either inefficiencies or less successful examples of that type of investment playing out?
Actually, I wanted to come back to Elsa's point here. It's an extraordinarily important one that we've heard already, that quantum information is considered basic research. It's considered basic science. There obviously is application that drives a lot of this. But in this case of quantum communications, we don't even know if it's useful. That's not unique, actually. We have yet to demonstrate that quantum computing is useful. We think that is coming reasonably soon. We know that quantum sensing is useful. We know that quantum clocks and quantum navigation are useful. But we don't know if certain parts of the application space in quantum technology are useful. And so the idea of building all of our strategic rivalry between two great powers, if you like that paradigm, based on a technology where we don't even know if it's useful, is indicative of maybe the low level of discourse that has surrounded this field because of the low level of understanding of the technology. That, again, is something I think is very important for us to fix.
Well, that's a terrific point, and I want to use that to kind of flip it back on something earlier that you had mentioned. So you said the NSA is not thrilled with this with quantum communication at this point, but from what I understand, and you also laid out, that quantum computers are solving fancy made-up problems just to kind of check and see how they're doing. My basic understanding of current encryption, right? So this wouldn't be going to quantum encryption, but just regular encryption, is it really just is a really big math problem. And that's why, certainly folks on this call and our friends up at Fort Meade might be a little more concerned about that, right? So our current communications are obviously traditional communications, digital, but they're encrypted just using big numbers that are hard to figure out what they are, right? So these big prime numbers, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about what quantum computing is going to do to that, and I guess the real question is, if quantum communications isn't really a thing, or isn't really a great thing, but quantum computing is, and it can break the encryption of current communications, what are your thoughts on that and the implications, and what do folks on this call need to be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, the first thing to say is that historically, the whole development of the field comes back to this application. The reason the NSA supported this university research program was because of the threat of that kind of computational capability to national security communications or general information security. The reality is that the machines that would be capable of performing that kind of computation remain quite a ways away. DARPA had a projection just a couple of weeks ago that I saw, which was a very ambitious projection because it was using published roadmaps for technology development as opposed to the trend of actual accomplishment. And even that said that factoring a reasonable number would not be accomplished until 2040, right? So this is a multi-decadal play. Now, that's important for two reasons. One, it says that the often breathless reporting about how quantum computing is going to break Bitcoin next year, it is false. It is not a true statement, right? That said, if one is preparing for the realization of a quantum computer that may in fact break public key crypto systems, 2040 may not be that far away. And so it may be strategically important to begin a transition to alternate cryptographic standards. Now, the passage I read referenced the idea that the NSA believes in quantum resistant encryption standards. And so NIST in the United States, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has been running a program for the development of alternate cryptographic standards that is alternate to the existing, RSA type approaches that rely on this particular math problem. It is generally believed that quantum computers, while useful for one particular math problem, are not necessarily going to have benefits against a wide variety of other cryptographic protocols. So it may be that we simply switch from one math problem to another in order to regain the strategic protection of this information in public key systems.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think the problem here is one of future proofing and looking over the horizon, and that is not always something that bureaucracies do well when it comes to modernization of information technology. We're talking about AI and the future of work and all of these very forward-leaning possibilities, but I think even one of the threats that has been raised that is more realistic than quantum computers breaking the internet. Mike can correct me if I'm off base here, but a possibility that has been raised is the risk of information that is currently encrypted and being collected and perhaps stockpiled today being decrypted by a quantum computer in the future. So that does seem feasible, perhaps not in the near term. If the information is 10, 20 years old by then, it won't be as relevant, but to the extent that information that is today encrypted could be vulnerable at that future moment of a sufficiently capable quantum computer becoming feasible, that I think is something that should concern all of us in the national security community today, and all of us who rely upon encryption as part of our daily lives as on the internet. That it does make sense to have those longer time horizons and thinking about risk in cybersecurity. And given that we have yet to solve cybersecurity problems we've known about for decades, and long-standing vulnerabilities have been unaddressed, I am worried about our prospects of getting ahead of the problem this time around. So I think the hype and alarmism are counterproductive, but there are real reasons for concern and reasons for organizations to think about preparing and anticipating that transition to quantum resistant cryptography over a shorter time horizon, even if we are still thinking decades for quantum computing itself.
That's a great point. We know that they are hoovering up as much as they can get their hands on, as I'm sure our friends at Fort Meade probably are as well. But that brings me to a very basic quantum computing question: does quantum affect storage at all, or is it simply the processing power? Because one would imagine at some point, Moore's law will give in, especially on the storage end, and it's going to hopefully, one would think, that'll come to an end, and it'll just be more and more unwieldy to store things. Does quantum play any role at all in storage of material?
That's a great question, and the answer is we don't know. Right now, quantum computers don't have memory. There is no concept of memory in the design and functioning of quantum computers that we have today. It's directly information in. There can be classical inputs, and then the information flows through the machine and is measured at the other end. We do not currently have what you would call coherent storage. Now, that's both for technological reasons, that we don't exactly know what the best way is to achieve this, but also just architecturally. This is not the paradigm of how we believe quantum computers can give net advantages, which is relevant to anybody who says one of two things. Either quantum computers are great for big data. They are not, because big data requires huge amounts of storage, and quantum computers are not big data machines. They are advanced algorithm machines. They are machines for solving very specific problems that are just hard for conventional machines. And then the other part is quantum computers are not a replacement for Moore's law. If Moore's law ends and we cease to see continued advances in computational capacity, classical computational capacity, we will not build useful quantum computers. Right? These things go together. We require huge amounts of classical computing power to make our quantum computers function. That is both in the real-time aspect and then in the overall application of an algorithm. These systems have, hazard to guess in terms of computational throughput. It's many orders of magnitude more classical compute grunt than there is quantum compute grunt in any of the systems that are being built now or in the next several years. And we think that will continue, that will always have this key need for more and more classical computing. So we have to have an alternate solution for some of those semiconductor manufacturing problems.
Well, that's a great way to kind of tie it to what we have today and what we may have in the future. And then the final question, because I know it's very early for you there, and you probably got to get some sleep before your real day job kicks in. But I wondered if you could kind of just loop us back to our first panel on AI and talk about if quantum computers are made for specific, typically kind of big math problems, what, if any, impact is it going to have on AI, which one would think are kind of more, at least in the classical computer sense, more kind of bringing things all together and kind of making sense of it, as opposed to just a brute force, big power, big problem?
It's a very interesting question. It's one that comes up a lot. Right now, the dominant intersection of these two fields is from the role of AI in operating and designing quantum computers. Again, this is, for full disclosure, this is a core area of activity in which my company engages. We develop new, say, reinforcement learning algorithms that can make quantum computers perform better. They can augment the performance of those machines. Now, from the alternate perspective, there's a huge amount of research interest in encoding data in a quantum way and then performing machine learning type applications on quantum data. It's a very exciting area of basic research, and at this point, I would say it remains inconclusive, that there are some potential threads that people are pulling on that look viable, but there are alternatives that we know have been excluded. For instance, Scott Aronson's team at University of Texas, he's a very famous theoretician in this field, has shown that the so-called Netflix algorithm, the recommendation algorithm, which has a quantum analog, cannot give an advantage on a quantum machine. All right, so that's an interesting demonstration that some of the hopes for quantum machine learning may not give us the net benefits that we automatically assumed would be there just by virtue of having this new computational capacity. I think it remains to be seen what the net impact of quantum and AI is, but it's I'll conclude with one really interesting observation. The idea of modeling quantum systems is a key driver for the development of quantum computers, right? We have quantum mechanical problems in, say, chemistry or material science, and they're very hard to shove into regular computers. It's very hard to build a computational model because you're throwing away most of the quantum information. Now, we know that building a quantum analog is an efficient way to go. But it's been shown very recently that in some cases, the use of conventional machine learning tools like deep neural networks have indicated that it actually can, in those circumstances, be reasonably easy to model very, very complicated interacting quantum systems. And so there appears to be this deep correspondence, perhaps mathematically, between the functioning of deep neural networks, of machine learning type algorithms, AI algorithms, and the behavior of strongly interacting quantum mechanical systems, which form the basis of quantum computers and other quantum technologies. And so it could be that in the future, there is in fact an alignment of these two technologies based on some of these early physics demonstrations. But it remains, I'll emphasize, very much an open scientific question that is attracting some of the greatest minds, men and women in the field.
And I'll just add that back in 2017, China's AI plan included quantum artificial intelligence as one of the important interdisciplinary intersections for future development. And there have been research underway in China that aims to achieve progress in quantum machine learning, or claims by Chinese scientists that some of their initial prototype quantum computers could have applications in machine learning in the future. But I think at this point, it's certainly uncertain, and will be fascinating to watch how this plays out going forward.
Well, I'll tell you, this has been absolutely fascinating. I've learned a ton. We've got 1,200 or so people on Facebook. We got another 100 or so, I think, over here on YouTube, plus the 300 or 400 that were here together on Zoom. So obviously fascinating stuff. Definitely on the minds of the U.S. Air Force, ACC, and everyone here in the U.S. So I appreciate taking the time. Elsa for doing both panels, Michael for getting up early, you know, when you probably got a full day ahead of you to talk to us about this. So certainly we will stay in touch. You know, CASI continues to look at all of these issues and how they're related to Chinese aerospace and the future of our national security. So we will certainly be in touch. And again, if anybody out there has follow-on questions or wants to get in touch, please reach out to CASI, and then we will go ahead and facilitate that. So on behalf of ACC and Colonel Ward, who sent me a note, said that they are up on video and audio, but we're in a particular location where they couldn't have a microphone. So they expressed their sincere gratitude and thank you on behalf of ACC and CASI. I really do appreciate it, and this was absolutely wonderful. And for those watching, we are going to make these available after the event. We'll put them up online. ACC will have access to them, so you can share them with your friends who are not fortunate enough to join it today. But one more time, thank you, Elsa. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everybody that watched. And we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care.